In the book Interpersonal Neurobiology, it talks about how in bipolar disorder, the brain doesn't have the relational fibers in the mid-prefrontal cortex. And relational fibers have to do with relating, being social. And Dr. Daniel Fisher talks about how mania, or psychosis I should say, is a monologue, and one is lost in their own world, which is their own interpretation, their own meaning, their own talk about the world, and they're not really relating to people. And it's interesting that the brain doesn't have the fibers of the mid-prefrontal cortex. Well, did the person have them before and they lost them? They don't have that data. But it seems that people don't have that. So I think in having these conversations, it might be able to perhaps create some more relational fibers of the mid-prefrontal cortex, because if a person has gone through bipolar mania and psychosis and they're not able to relate to reality anymore, well, if we can relate to each other, at least we are creating some relational conversation, which I would assume, or I would think, would create some of those relational fibers in the mid-prefrontal cortex. I don't know if it's true. It's worth a try. The thing with bipolar disorder is oftentimes after going through the experience, it is hard to relate to people for many reasons. Perhaps a person wants to talk about something different, and maybe we can have those conversations and see. And instead of having people without those relational fibers in isolation, if we can relate to each other and speak to each other, perhaps we can reinforce a new relational mind that's relating based on having different options and stories and language for talking about this experience. And when I think about language, and I think about when I was in my manic state the very first time, I remember trying to create new words, and I remember trying to derive words or find the meaning and hints in words that already exist, or find hidden meaning in sentences or phrases, and again, making up words. And when you think about how we relate through language and words, and sort of our language and words create our reality in that they create how we interpret and think about our reality, it's interesting that in that state, trying to make up new words, it's like I'm trying to create a new reality. And maybe some of those words had value. Did you ever try to make up words? You probably did. And I have actually heard of other people creating almost entire languages. And we could probably do a lot of good work around relanguaging some of the language that the world uses, and also maybe creating the language to explain and talk about and discuss and collaborate and commune on some of the things we experienced inwardly. It's almost like a language of that inner realm, that inner domain, that inner dimension, that we have some language for dreams, and it would be great to have language around these inner experiences, as it seems like that was one of the impulses in mania, was to create new language, or to see language differently, or to see the hidden meaning in language. It was quite obvious at the time. And so to me, it's really interesting with the language, with the conversation, with the missing prefrontal cortex, relational fibers, and it's like, why do those go missing? Were they already missing, or did they go missing? Or what is it? Maybe it's dormant because we're waiting to relate about something else instead of what TV show somebody watched last night, or, the best steak in town, when, I think eating cows is kind of obsolete. Maybe we're supposed to relate on visions and collaboration and altruism and magic and miracles. Why isn't reality and being alive as a human being like the most magical, miraculous experience? Because it is. Yet we need like iPhone games like Pokemon Go to feel that, when basically, mania feels like Pokemon Go on, times infinity. It's like, wow, going out and just exploring reality, and I don't need to find a Pokemon. I could find a really beautiful tree, or a really beautiful person, or a really beautiful flower, or a really beautiful insect, or really beautiful artwork, or really beautiful, fresh, crisp air, or really beautiful, delicious food, or just smiling at somebody. And I feel like the state of mania is an oxytocin dominant state. It's a lot about bonding and connection and being social. So it's interesting that those fibers would be missing, because it's a very relational state. It's very social. I wonder about that. But I feel it's important to create oxytocin experiences, because that's what bonds us and keeps us together. And that's another thing about this conversation, about changing and increasing the options for the language and vocabulary around people's experiences in mental health. Well, not mental health, but in extreme states of consciousness, is that it's more about a conversation and an exploration and a dialogue, and it's not about, oh, this is a big problem that we need to solve, let's think about how to solve it. It's more about adventure and exploration, and we had like an inner adventure, and we could share it and create some new language. This would actually grow our brain differently. It would grow it differently neuroplastically. The brain is neuroplastic, and the more we have conversation about this, the more we will have brain cell connections about this, and then the more we will talk about it in that way, and the more it will reinforce that in the fabric of society, and then that's the way it'll be seen. It's going to be seen the way it's talked about most. And right now it's talked about most in terms of mental illness, and I feel like it could use some other flavors. I like to think of it as creating a neighborhood of conversation. And I say neighborhood as opposed to something like community, because community assumes, in a way, it has the connotation that everybody is really thinking the same way, they're on board, they're all one, and that's a very nice notion, but that's really not how it is in reality. And it almost is exclusive, because it assumes that each person, it buys in 100% to whatever the community values. And a neighborhood is like a neighborhood in reality, where people live in the neighborhood and anyone can live anywhere, really. And so it's about being neighborly. It's about respecting that each person has their own life and values. But if you can lend a hand here or there, or you have a chit chat that may change someone's view a little bit or not, then that's great. So it's about being neighbors, and I feel like instead of online communities, we need to start having some online neighborhoods, which just, it's a little bit less pressure. Like, you're my neighbor online, but we're not necessarily a community. We're not necessarily united. And because then certain people won't maybe join. And to have a neighborhood conversation, maybe people that haven't experienced a diagnosis would like to join in the conversation, and they're curious. So sure, they can be a neighbor just because they're not a member of the community, because then that divides community from non-community, and then the conversation is limited, and you have to wait for somebody to become a member of your community before you can talk to them.